The three slave catchers laughed when they saw the rope tied between two trees crossing the swamp. "Look at this," mocked Thomas Caldwell, leader of the most feared patrol in Beaufort County, South Carolina. "Some slave thinks a rope's going to stop us." His companions, James Whitley and Robert Clean, sneered as they pushed their horses forward, trampling the simple rope blocking the path. It was their last laugh. The rope wasn't a barrier. It was a trigger. The moment the horses' hooves broke it, 3 tons of cypress logs fell from the tree canopies above, crushing riders and mounts together, pushing them into the deep swamp where they drowned in seconds, trapped under the weight of wood and mud. It was the 14th trap. 47 men had already died this way in 9 weeks. All professional slave catchers, all mocking the same simple trick before drowning. And the man who built each trap, who studied each trail, who calculated each weight and angle with careful precision, was a 36-year-old enslaved man named Caleb Johnson, whom they had dismissed as that simple Negro who plays with ropes. But Caleb wasn't playing. He was hunting hunters, and hunting season wasn't over yet. But to understand how Caleb Johnson became the most deadly trapmaker in South Carolina history, we must return to the spring of 1849, 3 years before the drownings began, to a plantation called Riverside in Beaufort County, deep in the heart of the Low Country. Beaufort County in 1849 was a landscape of contrasts. The land itself was breathtakingly beautiful, endless stretches of marshland where spartina grass swayed golden in the wind, ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss, winding tidal creeks that changed direction twice daily with the Atlantic's pull. But beneath this natural beauty lay one of the most brutal concentrations of human bondage in the entire South. The Sea Islands and surrounding low country held more enslaved people per square mile than almost anywhere else in America. Rice plantations dominated the economy, and rice cultivation required backbreaking labor in stinking swamps where malaria and yellow fever killed as efficiently as any overseer's whip. Riverside plantations sprawled across 2,300 acres of prime rice-growing land. Master Jonathan Whitfield owned 187 enslaved people, making him one of the wealthier planters in the district. The plantation produced an average of 300,000 pounds of rice annually, sold primarily through Charleston's busy port 30 miles north. Cotton prices were climbing as King Cotton tightened its grip on the southern economy. But in the Low Country, rice remained supreme. The crop demanded deep knowledge of tidal patterns, complex systems of dikes and floodgates, and enslaved workers who could labor waist-deep in swamp water for 12 hours straight. The social hierarchy at Riverside reflected the typical plantation structure of the era. At the top sat Master Whitfield, a third-generation planter who had inherited the land from his father. Below him, his wife, Mistress Catherine Whitfield, managed the household slaves with an iron fist wrapped in lace gloves. The overseer, Marcus Drummond, was a 42-year-old Scotsman who had worked his way up from poverty and saw enslaved people as livestock, to be maximized for profit. 3 drivers, enslaved men promoted to supervisory positions, enforced Drummond's orders in the fields. The enslaved population divided into clear classes: house slaves, skilled laborers like blacksmiths and carpenters, field hands, and at the bottom, the trash gang of children and elderly too weak for prime labor. Caleb Johnson occupied an unusual position in this hierarchy. Born on the plantation in 1813, he was neither field hand nor house slave, but something else entirely. His mother, Dinina, had been a skilled weaver brought from the Senegambia region of West Africa. She died when Caleb was 7, but before her death, she taught him something precious: how to read the land. Dinina came from a people who navigated by stars, who understood tides and seasons, who could predict weather by observing birds and insects. She taught Caleb to see patterns invisible to others, By age 12, Caleb had demonstrated an unusual ability to predict when rice fields would flood, which dikes would fail, where fish would school in the creeks. Master Whitfield's father, recognizing potential profit, assigned the boy to maintain the plantation's complex irrigation system. This role required Caleb to move freely across the property, inspecting gates, clearing channels, and ensuring water flowed properly through the rice fields. It also meant Caleb learned every inch of Riverside's 200-300 acres, every hidden path, every quicksand pit, every deep channel where currents ran treacherous. Caleb was a quiet man, average in height at 5'9", with the wiry build that came from constant movement rather than brute labor. His hands were calloused from rope work, his skin darkened almost black by decades of sun exposure. He had his mother's high cheekbones and wide-set eyes that seemed to look past rather than at people. Other enslaved workers considered him strange, too silent, too observant, spending hours watching water flow or birds migrate. Children thought him simple-minded because he would stare at a tree for 20 minutes saying nothing. But Caleb wasn't simple. He was studying, learning, waiting. He had married at 22, a woman named Sarah who worked in the big house as a seamstress. Sarah was everything Caleb wasn't. Talkative, laughing, full of warmth, she could turn scraps of cloth into beautiful quilts, could hum spirituals that made even the hardest days bearable. Together they had 3 children, a boy named Jacob, now 13, and twin daughters, Hannah and Grace, aged 10. Caleb's life revolved around 3 things: maintaining the waterworks that kept Riverside profitable, teaching his children everything his mother had taught him, and dreaming of freedom. He never spoke of escape. The low country was virtually impossible to flee. Surrounded by water and swamp, patrolled by professional slave catchers who knew the terrain intimately, cut off from the north by hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The Underground Railroad rarely reached this far south. Most enslaved people who ran from the Sea Islands either drowned in the attempt or were caught within days, then subjected to punishment so severe they served as warnings to everyone else. But Caleb watched and planned and waited for something he couldn't yet name. Master Jonathan Whitfield was 53 years old in the spring of 1849, a tall man running to fat with thinning gray hair and a red complexion that spoke of too much bourbon and too little exercise. He fancied himself a gentleman planter in the old tradition, cultured, paternalistic, a benevolent master to his people. He read agricultural journals, attended Episcopal services every Sunday, and belonged to the local militia company. In his own mind, Whitfield was a pillar of civilization, bringing order and Christianity to an inferior race that needed white guidance. The reality was considerably uglier. Whitfield's fortune rested entirely on the labor of human beings he owned like livestock. When rice prices dropped, he sold enslaved children away from their mothers to maintain his lifestyle. When production lagged, he ordered Drummond to increase the whipping quota. He had fathered at least 4 children by enslaved women, never acknowledging them publicly, while privately enjoying the power this gave him. His paternalism extended only as far as his profit margin allowed. His wife Catherine was 48, a Charleston belle who had married Whitfield for his money and spent 2 decades regretting it. She channeled her disappointment into tyrannizing the house slaves, finding satisfaction in the small cruelties that reminded her she still had power over someone. She would inspect the cleaning with white gloves, then beat the slave whose area showed even a speck of dust. She insisted on perfection in cooking, then threw plates at the cook if food arrived 1 minute late. Her jealousy of the younger enslaved women whom her husband raped expressed itself in casual violence. A hot iron pressed to skin, scalding water accidentally spilled, glass shards mixed into food. But the true monster at Riverside was Marcus Drummond, the overseer, a lean, hard man with ice-blue eyes and a permanent sneer. Drummond had grown up dirt poor in Scotland, immigrated to Charleston at 19, and clawed his way up through sheer brutality. He believed enslaved people were animals that responded only to pain, and he applied pain with scientific precision. Drummond had invented his own modifications to standard punishment techniques: whips soaked in brine to increase agony, iron collars with interior spikes that cut the neck with any movement, a sweatbox made of tin that he would place in the sun for hours at a time. Drummond took particular pleasure in breaking strong-willed slaves. He would identify the proud ones, the ones who maintained their dignity despite bondage, and systematically destroy them. His method was simple: find what they loved most, then take it away slowly, methodically, while they watched helpless. A mother who tried to protect her children, sell the children one by one over the course of a year, making her witness each departure. A man who took pride in his skill, assign him to the trash gang, deny him any opportunity to demonstrate competence. Drummond understood that psychological torture could be more effective than physical pain. The three drivers, Job, Samuel, and Peter, occupied the impossible position of enslaved people given authority over other enslaved people. The system was designed to corrupt them, and it largely succeeded. Job, the eldest at 47, had convinced himself that his cooperation earned better treatment for everyone, that things would be worse without him as a buffer between Drummond and the field hands. Samuel, 33, simply enjoyed the power, taking out his own humiliation on those below him. Peter, the youngest at 28, tried to maintain some humanity, going easier on workers when Drummond wasn't watching, but the system was grinding him down year by year. Riverside Plantation in 1849 was, in other words, a typical institution of Southern slavery, a machine designed to extract maximum profit from human misery while maintaining the fiction of civilized society. Whitfield attended church and quoted scripture. Catherine hosted tea parties for neighboring plantation mistresses. Drummond kept meticulous records of productivity and punishment. And beneath it all, 187 human beings lived in constant terror. Their lives and families and bodies treated as commodities to be bought, sold, used up, and replaced. Caleb had witnessed 15 years of this as an adult, watching the machine grind through generation after generation. He had seen friends sold south to the killing fields of Louisiana sugar plantations. He had seen women raped by masters who then sold their own children for profit. He had seen men whipped to death for the crime of looking a white man in the eye. He had watched children grow up knowing they were property, seeing the light die in their eyes as they accepted their condition. But Caleb had also seen something else. He had seen the slave catchers. Beaufort County had a thriving slave-catching industry. Professional trackers earned substantial bounties for returning fugitives, and the work attracted men who enjoyed the chase. These weren't ignorant, poor whites. They were skilled hunters who knew the swamps as well as anyone who could track a man through water, who worked with trained bloodhounds bred specifically for hunting humans. They traveled in groups heavily armed, and they almost always got their man. The most successful of these was Thomas Caldwell, a fourth-generation low-country native who had grown up hunting alligators and deer in the same swamps where enslaved people tried to hide. Caldwell employed a rotating crew of 6 to 10 men, owned a pack of 12 bloodhounds, and boasted a 93% success rate in recovering fugitives. He was 38 years old, unmarried, and made an excellent living from human misery. In the past 5 years, Caldwell and his crew had captured and returned 74 escaped slaves, earning an average of $50 per head. Most of these captures resulted in brutal public punishments designed to deter others from running. Caleb had watched Caldwell work several times. In the fall of 1846, a field hand named Abraham had run after his wife was sold to a planter in Georgia. Abraham lasted 4 days before Caldwell's dogs found him hiding in a cypress grove 8 miles from Riverside. Drummond had Abraham whipped 100 times in the plantation yard while every enslaved person was forced to watch, then cut the tendons in his ankles so he could never run again. Abraham died 3 months later from infection. In the spring of 1847, a woman named Phyllis tried to escape with her 2 children after Whitfield sold her husband to a trader. Caldwell caught them the second night, used the children as leverage to make Phyllis surrender without a fight. The children were sold immediately as punishment. Phyllis hanged herself in the quarters a week later. Caleb watched these hunts with his characteristic silence, saying nothing, his face showing nothing. But inside something was calculating, learning, understanding the patterns of how Caldwell hunted. The slave catchers always used the same routes through the swamps, the paths that appeared safest, where water was shallow, where solid ground was wide enough for horses. They relied on their knowledge of the terrain, their confidence that they knew the low country better than any ignorant slave could. They mocked the crude attempts escapees made to throw off pursuit, wading through water, climbing trees, doubling back. To men like Caldwell, hunting enslaved people was sport, easy money, and a service to civilization all at once. But Caleb saw something the slave catchers didn't. He saw men grown arrogant through success. Men who assumed their prey would always be weaker, stupider, more desperate. He saw hunters who never considered that they themselves might become prey, and slowly, over years of watching, an idea formed, not escape, something else. Something that required patience, planning, and perfect understanding of the very swamps where Caldwell had hunted so many to their recapture or death. Caleb's life at Riverside continued its familiar pattern through the late 1840s. He maintained the irrigation system, fixed floodgates, cleared channels, all while speaking little and observing everything. Other enslaved workers had long since dismissed him as strange but harmless. Master Whitfield considered him a valuable asset precisely because he was so quiet and predictable, never causing trouble, always exactly where he was supposed to be. But in the privacy of his own mind, Caleb was drawing maps, mental maps of every trail, every deep channel, every stand of trees large enough to hide falling logs, every patch of quicksand, every tidal pool that looked shallow but dropped away to 6 feet of water. He catalogued cypress trees thick enough to support weight, recorded which paths flooded during spring tides, noted where bloodhounds lost scent at creek crossings. His children were growing. Jacob at 13 was being eyed for field work, his childhood ending as the plantation's needs required stronger backs. Hannah and Grace helped their mother with sewing now, their small fingers valuable for delicate work. Caleb watched them and felt the familiar, helpless rage that every enslaved parent knew, the knowledge that he couldn't protect them, that their futures were determined by people who saw them as property worth only what their labor could produce. Sarah noticed the change in her husband, though she couldn't name exactly what had shifted. Caleb had always been quiet, but lately his silences seemed deeper, more purposeful. Sometimes she would catch him staring at nothing, his eyes focused on something invisible, his hands unconsciously mimicking motions, tying knots, measuring distances, calculating angles. When she asked him about it, he would smile gently and say he was just tired. He was lying. Caleb was designing death traps. The spring of 1852 brought the catalyst that transformed Caleb's careful observations into action. Master Whitfield's finances had worsened, rice prices were down, expenses were up, and his gambling debts in Charleston had reached the point where creditors were demanding payment. The solution, as always, meant selling enslaved people to raise quick cash. On April 20th, 1852, a slave trader named Edmund Garrison arrived at Riverside with a coffle chain, iron collars connected by lengths of chain designed to march multiple people together to market. Whitfield had arranged to sell 12 slaves, carefully selected to maximize profit, young, healthy, with enough skill to command good prices, but not so valuable that losing them would hurt plantation operations. One of the 12 was Jacob, Caleb's 13-year-old son. The news spread through the quarters like wildfire. Sarah collapsed when she heard her wails echoing across the slave cabins. Hannah and Grace clung to their mother, not fully understanding but terrified by her terror. And Caleb, when Job, the driver, delivered the news, simply nodded once and went back to work. He showed no emotion, said nothing, asked for nothing, just returned to inspecting a floodgate near the south field, as if his son's impending sale meant nothing at all. But that night, after Sarah had finally cried herself into exhausted sleep, after the children had been comforted as much as possible, Caleb sat outside their cabin and looked at the stars his mother had taught him to read. His face was completely still, his breathing regular, his body relaxed. Anyone watching would have seen a man at peace inside. Caleb Johnson was becoming something new, not a man planning escape, not even a man planning simple revenge. He was transforming into something the slave catchers of Beaufort County had never encountered. A predator who understood both the hunters and the terrain better than they understood themselves. His mother's people had a word for what Caleb felt in that moment. In her language it meant the patience of the crocodile, the ability to wait perfectly still beneath the water's surface, invisible, until the moment to strike became inevitable. Caleb decided he would not kill Whitfield or Drummond or Garrison. That would be too quick, too obvious, and it wouldn't change the system. Instead, he would do something that had never been done in the Low Country. He would make the system eat itself. He would make the slave catchers, those men who profited from hunting human beings, who made escape impossible, who were the true enforcers of the entire structure, afraid to hunt. The plan formed with crystal clarity over the next 3 days, while Caleb continued his work and showed no outward sign of anything changing. He would create a series of traps along the routes slave catchers always used. The traps would appear harmless, childish, even simple ropes, obvious obstacles, things that confident hunters would dismiss or trample without thought. But each would be a trigger for something lethal. The genius of Caleb's plan was its simplicity. He wouldn't try to hide the traps. He would make them visible, make them look crude and desperate, make them seem like the pathetic attempts of terrified fugitives. The slave catcher's own arrogance would be the deadliest component. They would see a rope across a path and laugh at the ignorance of whoever placed it there. They would break through it without hesitation, and they would die. Caleb had 3 advantages no one else possessed. First, he knew the exact routes Caldwell and other catchers used. He had watched them for years. Second, his role maintaining irrigation meant he moved freely across not just Riverside, but neighboring plantations, giving him access to miles of territory. Third, his reputation as simple meant no one would suspect him of intelligence sufficient to plan anything complex. On April 23rd, Edmund Garrison's coffle marched away from Riverside. 12 people, chained together at the neck, including 13-year-old Jacob, headed to Charleston's slave market. Sarah tried to run after them, screaming her son's name until Drummond had her restrained and threatened with a whipping if she didn't quiet down. Caleb stood at the edge of the quarters and watched his son disappear down the road. The boy, looking back once, with eyes that pleaded for a father's protection that would never come. Caleb's face showed nothing, but something behind his eyes had turned to ice. That night, he began building the first trap. Caleb had chosen his first target location with extreme care. 3 miles north of Riverside, a well-used trail cut through dense swampland, where the water ran dark with tannins and cypress knees jutted from the muck like wooden teeth. The trail was popular with slave catchers because it connected several plantations and provided solid enough footing for horses while still being narrow enough that fugitives couldn't easily slip past pursuit. Thomas Caldwell had used this exact path to catch Abraham back in 1846. The plan for Trap 1 was elegant in its simplicity. Caleb identified two massive cypress trees standing 40 feet apart, with the trail running between them. Both trees were old-growth specimens, their trunks 6 feet in diameter, their canopies spreading like green umbrellas overhead. Between them, the trail crossed a section where solid ground was only about 8 feet wide with deep water on either side. Over the course of 3 nights, working in absolute darkness, moving with the silence his mother had taught him was sacred, Caleb constructed his masterpiece. First, he selected and felled 3 cypress logs from dead trees deeper in the swamp, each log 12 feet long and weighing roughly 1,000 pounds. He stripped them of branches, shaped their ends, and dragged them one by one to his target trees. The work was brutal, accomplished entirely alone, since bringing accomplices would mean sharing knowledge that could be tortured out of them later. Using techniques his mother had taught him about leverage and counterweight, techniques passed down from African engineering traditions that white people dismissed as primitive, Caleb rigged a system of vines and rope in the tree canopies. The 3 logs were hauled up and positioned horizontally across the trail, held in place 60 feet above the ground by carefully balanced tension. The key was the release mechanism, a single rope stretched across the trail at chest height, tied to both trees, but running up through a series of vine loops to the weight-bearing system above. From ground level, anyone approaching would see only the rope barrier. It looked like exactly what Caldwell would expect from a desperate fugitive. A crude attempt to slow pursuit, maybe by a few minutes. The kind of obstacle a mounted rider would simply crash through without breaking stride. But the rope wasn't meant to stop anyone. It was designed to break under minimal pressure, specifically the pressure of a horse trampling it. And the moment it broke, the tension holding 3 tons of cypress logs 60 feet overhead would release simultaneously. Caleb tested the mechanism twice using weighted bags to simulate a horse breaking the trigger rope. Both times the logs fell with devastating speed, crashing to earth with impact that would crush anything underneath. He reset the trap each time, adjusting the balance until it was perfect. The final touch was what Caleb called the drowning ground. Immediately beneath where the logs would fall, he spent 2 nights subtly deepening the water on both sides of the trail, digging out muck to create pools 6 feet deep. When the logs fell and crushed riders into these pools, the weight of the timber would hold victims underwater. Even if the initial impact didn't kill them, drowning would finish the work. On the morning of May 1st, 1852, Caleb finished his preparations. The trap was set. The logs hung invisible in the canopy, balanced perfectly, waiting. The trigger rope stretched across the trail, looking exactly like the desperate work of someone who didn't understand how to actually stop pursuers. Now all Caleb needed was bait. He waited 4 days. On May 5th, a field hand from the neighboring Thornton plantation named Moses made a run for it after being threatened with sale. Moses was 41, strong but not young, and he had virtually no chance of reaching freedom. But like so many before him, desperation overrode logic. He ran just before dawn, heading north into the swamps, hoping somehow to evade the inevitable pursuit. By noon, Thomas Caldwell and his crew had been alerted and hired. Caldwell brought 3 men with him that day. James Whitley, his most experienced tracker, Robert Clean, a local hunter who supplemented his income with slave catching, and a younger man named David Foster who was learning the trade. They had 6 bloodhounds and the absolute confidence of men who had never failed at this work. Caleb, working on a floodgate repair 2 miles away, heard the dogs baying as the hunt began. He calculated trajectories and timing in his head. Moses had maybe a 3-hour lead. Caldwell would track him efficiently, pushing hard because capturing fugitives quickly was part of his reputation. The route Moses would most likely take, running from fear rather than strategy, would lead him straight toward the trapped trail. Everything depended on Caldwell following his usual patterns. Caleb returned to Riverside at the normal time, showed no unusual interest in the hunt. ate his evening meal with Sarah and the girls. Hannah asked why Jacob hadn't come home yet. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Caleb told his daughters their brother had gone to live somewhere else for a while, that they would see him again someday. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. That night, lying awake while Sarah finally slept, Caleb listened to the distant sounds of the hunt, barking dogs, shouted commands, the splash of horses moving through water. The sounds were heading north, toward the trail, toward the rope. He waited. The moon was just past full, providing enough light to see by. Caleb estimated Caldwell would reach the trap trail around midnight if the hunt followed typical patterns. He closed his eyes and imagined the moment, the confident riders approaching, seeing the rope, laughing at its futility, spurring their horses forward without hesitation. Somewhere around midnight, the night swallowed all sound. The dogs stopped baying. The shouts ceased. For perhaps 10 minutes, absolute silence pressed down on the swamp. Then screaming began. Human screaming. Not the baying of dogs, but high-pitched shrieks of terror and agony that cut through the darkness like knives. The screams lasted perhaps 30 seconds before choking off into wet silence. Caleb allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The crocodile had struck. He slept peacefully for the first time since his son was sold. The discovery of Thomas Caldwell's body, along with those of James Whitley and Robert Clean, came at dawn on May 6th, when David Foster, who had been 50 yards behind the others when the logs fell, stumbled into Beaufort, babbling and incoherent. He had spent the night alone in the swamp, terrified to approach the trap site in darkness, finally working up courage at first light to see what had happened. What he found was carnage. 3 men crushed beneath cypress logs in a pool of blood-darkened water. The horses were dead too, necks broken by the impact. All 3 riders had drowned, even if the initial crushing hadn't killed them immediately. The weight of the logs held them underwater, faces pressed into muck and blood. The rope trigger was still visible, broken ends lying on either side of the trail. Sheriff William Harrison arrived with a dozen armed men by mid-morning. What they saw defied explanation. The engineering required to position those logs overhead, the precise balance needed, the understanding of leverage and counterweight. It all seemed impossible for someone with no education, no tools beyond what could be improvised from nature. Harrison's first thought was that a group of fugitives had worked together, maybe with the help of abolitionists from the north. No single slave could have built this, he insisted. The sophistication was too high. Moses, the original fugitive, was found hiding 3 miles away and captured easily with Caldwell's dogs. He swore he knew nothing about any trap, had never seen the trail before, didn't even know Caldwell had been killed until the sheriff told him. Under torture, 100 lashes and thumbscrews, Moses maintained his ignorance. Harrison believed him. The man was clearly too simple to have built something so complex. Word of the trap spread through Beaufort County like wildfire. Thomas Caldwell had been the best slave catcher in the region, and he'd been killed by an invisible mechanism that used his own momentum against him. The other catchers began looking at the swamps differently, wondering what else might be waiting in the canopies or beneath the water. But after a week of heightened tension, practical economics reasserted themselves. Caldwell's death had created a vacuum in the slave-catching business, which meant opportunity. New hunters moved in to claim his territory and customers. The bounties were too good, the work too profitable. Within 2 weeks, the hunts resumed at normal frequency. Caleb had expected this. He was counting on it. He built Trap 2 in early June, using a different mechanism but the same principle of appearing crude while being devastatingly effective. This time he chose a creek crossing where the water ran shallow over rocks. A natural ford that slave catchers used regularly because it was one of the few places horses could cross easily. The trap exploited the difference between low tide and high tide. At low tide, the ford was barely ankle deep, perfectly safe. But Caleb understood the tidal schedule with precision. His mother had taught him to calculate by watching the moon and feeling pressure changes in the air. He positioned sharpened cypress stakes just beneath the waterline at the ford, angled upward at 45 degrees, and hardened in fire until they could pierce leather and flesh. During low tide, they were exposed and obvious, but at high tide, the water rose 18 inches, completely concealing them while still appearing shallow enough to cross. The key was timing. Caleb calculated that any hunt beginning at dawn would reach this ford around 8 fawn in the morning, which would be exactly the height of high tide for the next 3 weeks. The stakes would be invisible, but the water would look no deeper than usual. Just another safe crossing. On June 13th, a young woman named Betsy ran from the Fairfield plantation after being raped repeatedly by the overseer. She was 23, pregnant from the rapes, and had finally snapped when the overseer announced he would sell the baby as soon as it was born. She ran knowing she had no chance, running because remaining was unbearable. The slave catchers, a 4-man crew led by a hunter named Marcus Webb, who was trying to establish himself in Caldwell's former territory, picked up her trail before noon. They pursued with the confidence of men who did this work every day, who saw fugitive slaves as easy money, who had never once failed to return with their quarry. Betsy reached the ford at 8:23 in the morning, right on schedule with Caleb's calculations. The water looked shallow. She waded across easily, the stakes still submerged, but not yet at their highest point, with the tide still rising. The hunters reached the ford 17 minutes later, 4 men on horseback moving at a trot, eager to close the distance. The water looked safe. They had crossed this exact ford dozens of times. Marcus Webb's horse hit the first stake through its chest. The animal screamed and reared, throwing Webb forward into 3 more stakes that impaled him through the stomach and thigh. The second rider's horse was pierced through the neck, collapsing sideways and crushing its rider's leg against the rocks. The third and fourth men saw the carnage and tried to pull their horses back, but momentum and the ford's rocky bottom made stopping impossible. Both horses were wounded, one fatally, and both riders were thrown. Marcus Webb lived for 6 hours, screaming until his voice gave out, impaled on stakes he couldn't pull himself off of without tearing his intestines out further. The second rider drowned when his crushed leg trapped him face down in water that wouldn't have covered his head if he could have stood. The other 2 survived, but were wounded badly enough that their slave-catching careers ended that day. Betsy was never found. Whether she drowned trying to cross deeper water elsewhere, died of exposure in the swamps, or somehow found her way to the Underground Railroad remained unknown. But her flight had cost the slave catchers 4 men and 6 horses. Sheriff Harrison returned to the scene with a much larger posse. This time the pattern was becoming clear. Elaborately designed traps positioned along commonly used routes. Traps that looked like crude attempts at obstacles but concealed sophisticated death mechanisms. Someone was waging war on slave catchers specifically. Harrison increased patrols, offered rewards for information, and personally interrogated enslaved people from 6 plantations near the trap sites. No one knew anything. The traps appeared with no witnesses, no warnings, no accomplices who could be tortured into confession. The cruel irony was that the very system of terror that kept enslaved people compliant now worked against discovering the trap maker. Everyone was so isolated, so afraid to trust anyone else, so conditioned to keep their heads down and reveal nothing that even if someone had seen Caleb working at night, they would never have reported it. The walls of silent slavery created couldn't be breached even when white people wanted them broken. But the trap maker couldn't be one person. Harrison insisted. The amount of labor, the engineering knowledge, the coordination required, it had to be a conspiracy, probably with outside help. He was wrong. It was one man, a simple man who played with ropes, a man whose son had been sold away and whose wife wept herself to sleep each night, a man who had spent his entire life learning to be invisible while seeing everything. Caleb built Trap 3 in late June. This time he used fire. He chose a narrow trail through dense palmetto undergrowth where the vegetation grew thick on both sides, creating a natural tunnel. The path was popular with catchers because it was the only route through that section that didn't require dismounting. Over the course of 4 nights, Caleb carefully coated the palmetto fronds with rendered pig fat and pine resin, creating a combustible corridor 50 yards long. The coating was invisible unless you looked closely, and no one looked closely at random underbrush. At the trail's far end, he rigged another rope trigger, but this one was different. It released a suspended bundle of burning pitch that would ignite the moment someone broke through it. The concept was simple. Riders would enter the corridor seeing what looked like another crude rope obstacle. They would break through it without hesitation. The trigger would release fire from above and behind them, instantly igniting the fat and resin-coated vegetation on both sides. The corridor would become an inferno in seconds, with flames blocking retreat and pursuing anyone trying to escape forward. On July the 2nd, twin brothers named Samuel and Joseph ran from the Richmond plantation after their mother was whipped to death for breaking a dish. They were both 16, both field hands, both knowing they would be killed for running, but no longer caring. They fled south into the dense palmetto country. The slave-catching crew that responded was led by a man named Robert Jennings, along with his son William, and 2 hired hands, 6 men total, all mounted, all armed, all confident. They picked up the twins' trail by mid-afternoon and pushed hard to catch them before nightfall. The twins reached the palmetto corridor at dusk, saw the rope, considered trying to go around it but heard dogs baying close behind. In desperation, they broke through the rope and kept running. Nothing happened. The trigger failed. Caleb's burning pitch bundle had been extinguished by an afternoon rainstorm he hadn't anticipated. The twins made it through safely. The trap had failed, but Caleb had built a backup into the design. The trigger mechanism was dual purpose. If the burning pitch had been wet and failed to ignite, the breaking of the rope still released a second payload. A massive net weighted with rocks that dropped from the canopy onto anyone coming through the corridor. The hunting party crashed through 40 minutes after the twins, right as full darkness was falling. The net caught all 6 riders simultaneously, the weight of the rocks dragging them from their horses into a tangled mass. While they struggled to free themselves, cursing and cutting at the rope, Caleb emerged from the underbrush. This was the first time he had directly confronted his victims. Up until now, he had remained completely removed, letting his traps work autonomously. But this time the trap had failed its primary purpose, and improvisation was necessary. Caleb carried a torch in one hand and a long wooden pole in the other. The men saw him approach, saw the torch, and suddenly understood. The corridor hadn't been designed to burn on trigger. It had been designed to burn on command after victims were immobilized. "Please," Robert Jennings began. "Please, we're just..." Caleb touched his torch to the nearest resin-coated palmetto. The fire spread with terrifying speed, racing along both sides of the corridor in a wave of orange flame that illuminated faces twisted in horror. The men screamed and thrashed, trying to free themselves from the net. But the rope was thick and the rocks were heavy, and the fire was so fast. Caleb watched for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to be certain. Then he turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving 6 men to burn alive in a trap they had dismissed as crude and simple. The smoke could be seen from miles away. By the time help arrived, there was nothing left but charred bones tangled in rope and 6 horses that had fled in terror. The twins were never seen again, presumed drowned or dead from exposure in the deep swamps beyond. The burning of 6 slave catchers marked a turning point. This wasn't the work of random traps anymore. Someone had been present, had watched, had deliberately lit the fire while men begged for mercy. This was personal. This was murder, not mechanical accident. Sheriff Harrison called an emergency meeting of every planter in Beaufort County. The slave-catching business was collapsing. No one wanted the work anymore. Not when the swamps had turned into death zones. Fugitives were escaping at unprecedented rates because there was no one willing to pursue them. The economic impact was severe. Enslaved people represented the largest capital investment most planters owned. If they couldn't be recovered when they ran, the entire system's financial stability was threatened. Insurance rates on slave property quadrupled. Some smaller planters began selling out and moving north, unwilling to accept the risk. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the slave quarters of every plantation in the Low Country. Someone was fighting back. Someone was killing the catchers. No one knew who, but the possibility that resistance was achievable, that the hunters could become hunted, was a spark landing in dry tinder. Master Whitfield grew increasingly paranoid. He ordered additional security measures, locked quarters at night, random searches for weapons or tools, brutal punishment for any slave caught more than 100 yards from their work area without explicit permission. Drummond enthusiastically enforced these new rules, finding excuses to whip 3 or 4 people daily. Caleb continued his work maintaining the irrigation system, speaking little, showing no reaction to the heightened security. He was stopped and searched 4 times by Drummond personally, but all they ever found were the tools of his trade: rope, wooden stakes, simple implements for managing water gates. No one thought to wonder why a man who maintained floodgates would need 50 feet of rope on him at all times. No one connected the quiet, simple Negro who fixed water problems with the sophisticated death traps killing slave catchers miles away. Caleb built Trap 4 in late July. This one used the swamp's own geography as a weapon. He identified a section of trail that ran along the edge of a deep sinkhole, the kind of geological formation common in the Low Country where limestone beneath the surface eroded away, creating sudden drop-offs hidden beneath shallow water and vegetation. The particular sinkhole Caleb chose was 18 feet deep and roughly circular, 30 feet in diameter. Its edges were disguised by a thick growth of duckweed and water plants that made it look like solid marsh ground. Caleb spent 2 weeks carefully weakening the vegetation mat on the side nearest the trail, removing enough root structure that it would collapse under the weight of a horse, but still look solid enough to walk on. He created a false trail that appeared to be a shortcut around a patch of thick undergrowth leading directly over the weakened vegetation. On August 9th, a family of 5 tried to escape together from the Oakmont plantation. A father, mother, and 3 children aged 6 to 12. They had learned they were all being sold to different buyers and would be separated permanently. They ran knowing it was hopeless, running as a family one last time. The slave-catching crew had grown smaller and more expensive. Only 3 men responded to the bounty call, and they demanded double the normal fee up front. They were nervous, suspicious of every trail, checking overhead constantly for falling logs, using long poles to probe water before crossing. But they didn't check the vegetation mat that looked like solid ground. The father and eldest child made it across. Their combined weight wasn't quite enough to break through, but when the 3 catchers and their horses attempted to follow, the vegetation gave way instantly. All 3 riders and mounts plunged into the sinkhole, thrashing in water too deep to stand in, while mud and decomposing plant matter turned the water opaque. 2 of the 3 men drowned within minutes, dragged under by their equipment and heavy boots. The 3rd managed to stay afloat for nearly an hour, screaming for help that never came. The swamp swallowed him slowly, while the family he'd been hunting watched from the trees, then continued their flight. The family was caught 3 days later by a patrol from a neighboring county. The father was hanged immediately as an example. The mother and children were sold separately, scattered across 3 states. But the 3 slave catchers were dead, and the count was now rising to numbers that could no longer be dismissed as unfortunate accidents. By the end of August 1852, 17 slave catchers had died in 9 weeks. 17. Some crushed by logs, some impaled on stakes, some burned alive, some drowned in sinkholes. Every single death occurred along commonly used trails in traps that looked crude, but functioned with lethal precision. The professional slave-catching industry in Beaufort County had effectively ceased to exist. Men who had made their living hunting fugitives found other work. Dogs were sold, equipment was abandoned. The financial calculation no longer made sense. The risk of death had become too high relative to the $50 bounties, and the absence of slave catchers meant fugitives actually had a chance. Not a good chance, but a chance. Some drowned. Some died of exposure, but some made it north, reaching the underground railroad stations that were beginning to establish routes into the deep South. For the first time in decades, enslaved people in the Low Country could run without the absolute certainty of being caught within days. Sheriff Harrison knew he was facing someone with detailed knowledge of every trail, every water route, every technique the catchers had used. Someone who understood the territory perfectly and had both the intelligence to design sophisticated mechanisms and the patience to implement them over months. Someone who moved unseen, worked alone, and left no evidence beyond the traps themselves. Harrison compiled a list of every enslaved person in the county with the skills and opportunity to build the traps. Blacksmiths who could work metal, carpenters who understood construction, field hands who knew the swamps. The list numbered over 300 people. Caleb Johnson was on that list. Maintains irrigation at Riverside, moves freely, knows swamps, simple-minded but capable with rope. Harrison interviewed him personally in mid-September. Caleb stood with his hat in his hands, eyes downcast, speaking in the slow, careful way enslaved people learned to speak with whites. Yes, master, he knew the swamps. No, master, he never saw anyone building traps. Yes, master, he heard about the catchers dying. Terrible thing, master. He didn't know who could do such terrible things. Harrison watched him carefully, but all he saw was what everyone saw, a quiet, simple Negro who fixed water gates. Not a man capable of engineering death mechanisms that had baffled the county's best minds. The interview ended. Caleb returned to work. That night, he built Trap 5. The systematic elimination of slave catchers continued through September and into October. Trap 5 used a variant of the drowning technique, creating a false bottom in what appeared to be a shallow stream crossing. Trap 6 employed a landslide of carefully loosened boulders. Trap 7 was another fire corridor, this time with a backup ignition system that couldn't be defeated by rain. Each trap claimed between 2 and 5 victims. The total death toll climbed to 29 by mid-October, then 34, then 39. Every professional slave catcher in Beaufort County was either dead or had fled the work. Some had left the county entirely, unwilling to risk hunting in swamps that had become graveyards. The economic impact rippled outward. Plantation values dropped as the risk of slave flight increased. Some planters hired private armed patrols to watch their property, but these men refused to pursue fugitives into the swamps. They would guard boundaries but nothing more. Insurance companies began refusing to issue policies on slave property in Beaufort County at any price. Master Whitfield was quietly going bankrupt. Rice prices remained low. His gambling debts were accumulating, and now the value of his human property had plummeted because he couldn't prevent or recover from escapes. He began drinking heavily, screaming at servants over minor infractions, threatening to sell half his workforce just to make ends meet. Sarah approached Caleb one night in late October with a question she'd been afraid to ask. "It's you, isn't it?" she whispered. "The traps. It's you." Caleb looked at his wife. the woman who had given him 3 children, who had stood by him through 15 years of bondage, whose eyes still held tears for the son who had been sold. He considered lying, protecting her through ignorance. But Sarah deserved the truth. "Yes," he said simply. She was silent for a long moment. Then, "How many?" 43. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. "Caleb, they'll kill you if they find out. They'll kill all of us." "I know." "Then why?" "Because Jacob is gone." Caleb's voice was soft, but carried a weight that made Sarah stop breathing. "Because they sold our son like he was a horse, because they rape our women and sell our children and work us until we die, and they call it civilization, because the catchers were what made escape impossible. Without them, some people have a chance, not many but some, and when they catch you they won't. I'm too simple, too quiet, just a Negro who fixes water gates." Sarah studied her husband's face in the dim light from their cabin's hearth. She saw the man she had married, but also something new, something hard and cold and absolutely implacable, the crocodile beneath still water. 43, she repeated. "And I'm not finished." She should have been horrified, should have begged him to stop, should have thought of their daughters, of the danger he was bringing to their family. But Sarah had lived her entire life as property, had been bought and sold and used, had watched her son taken in chains while her husband stood powerless, had experienced every degradation and humiliation the system could devise. "Good," she said finally. "Kill them all." Caleb built Trap 8 in early November. This one represented an evolution in his technique, not just a single mechanism, but a sequence that would channel victims from one danger into another. He chose a section of trail that ran through a narrow ravine where water ran fast over rocks. The trail was popular because it provided solid ground on both sides of the water and led towards several plantations. Caleb turned it into a killing box. First, he blocked the trail's normal path with fallen trees positioned to look like storm damage, forcing riders to detour into the ravine itself, where the water ran. Second, he rigged the ravine's north side with the now familiar falling log mechanism, triggered by movement through a certain section of the water. Third, and this was new, he poisoned the water downstream with crushed oleander seeds, enough to sicken horses that drank after being ridden hard in pursuit. The trap was designed to force victims into one of 3 fates: take the normal trail and hit the tree blockage, forcing a detour. Detour into the ravine and trigger the falling logs. Survive the logs, but have horses drink poisoned water downstream, stranding the riders miles from help in hostile swamp with no mounts. On November 7th, a large-scale escape attempt involved 9 enslaved people from 3 different plantations. They had coordinated through the underground network of communication that connected quarters across the county, planning to run together and split up once into deep swamp, making pursuit harder. A militia company responded rather than slave catchers, 23 armed men, most on horseback, organized more as a military operation than a simple fugitive recovery. The militia's commander, Captain Richard Thornton, was confident that overwhelming force would succeed where individual catchers had failed. They hit the tree blockage at mid-morning, found the trail blocked, and made the logical choice to detour into the ravine. 17 riders entered the water in a strung-out column. The lead riders cleared the trigger point safely, but the middle of the column, a dense cluster of 8 men, hit the trigger zone simultaneously. 3 tons of cypress logs fell from both sides of the ravine, catching 8 riders in a vise of falling timber. The impact killed 4 instantly. 2 more died trapped underwater as the logs pinned them like the first trap had done months ago. The remaining 2 survived, but were crippled, one with a crushed pelvis, the other with a shattered spine that would leave him paralyzed. The 7 riders who had crossed safely immediately retreated, wanting nothing more to do with swamps that killed with such precision. The 5 riders, still behind the blockage, heard the screaming, saw the carnage, and also withdrew. None of the militia pursued further. Captain Thornton reported that hunting fugitives in Beaufort County swamps was now a military impossibility. The terrain had been turned into a death trap that claimed 8 lives and crippled 2 more in a single morning. All 9 fugitives escaped. Some were recaptured weeks later in other counties. Some drowned. Some reached freedom. But they got away, which was what mattered. The death toll was now 47, achieved in exactly 9 weeks as Caleb had originally calculated. The response from the white community was panic bordering on hysteria. If a full militia company refused to pursue fugitives, then the entire system of slavery control had broken down without the ability to recover runaways, without the deterrent of certain capture. What was to stop mass escapes? What was to prevent coordinated uprisings? Governor John Richardson called an emergency session of the state legislature. The Beaufort situation was declared a crisis. Rewards totaling $5,000 were offered for information leading to the trapmakers' capture. Professional bounty hunters from as far away as Virginia were recruited to come south. None of it mattered. The bounty hunters arrived, looked at the swamps, looked at the casualty reports, and quietly departed. The rewards went unclaimed because no one had information. Caleb worked alone at night and left no witnesses. The crisis continued. In the slave quarters across Beaufort County, a different kind of conversation was happening. People who had lived their entire lives in hopeless bondage were suddenly discussing escape as a real possibility. The catchers were gone. The militia wouldn't pursue into the swamps. Yes, the journey north was still nearly impossible. Yes, most would still die in the attempt, but some were making it. The family from Riverside, the twins Samuel and Joseph, who vanished. The family of 5, whose trail went cold. Stories spread of people who ran and weren't caught, who disappeared into legend who might be free. Master Whitfield called a meeting of all Riverside's enslaved population in late November. Drummond stood beside him with a whip. Whitfield announced that security would be quadrupled, that anyone caught outside their quarters after dark would be shot on sight, that any escape attempt would result in 10 people being sold south, regardless of who actually ran. The enslaved workers stood silent, eyes downcast, showing nothing. But Caleb felt the difference. There was fear, yes, but underneath it something new, the faintest glimmer of possibility. That night, a field hand named Thomas approached Caleb's cabin after dark, risking death to speak with him. Thomas was 26, strong and clever. He had a wife and newborn daughter. "Is it true?" Thomas asked quietly. "Are you the one?" Caleb could have denied it, should have denied it for safety, but he saw in Thomas's eyes the same desperation he had felt when Jacob was sold, the same rage at watching your family treated as property. "What do you want?" Caleb asked instead. "To run. Me, my wife, my baby. We want to go north, but I don't know the swamps like you do. I need to know which ways are safe, which ways you've made safe." Caleb studied the younger man. Helping him was risky, but he had built the traps for exactly this purpose, not vengeance alone, but creating escape routes that bypassed the areas where catchers had hunted most effectively. He gave Thomas detailed instructions, which trails to avoid, which creeks to follow, where to find food and water, how to read the stars his mother had taught him to see. Thomas listened with absolute concentration, committing every detail to memory. "Thank you," Thomas said finally. "My daughter's name is Hope. First time we chose a name ourselves, not what Master chose. We named her Hope because of you, because of what you've done. I haven't done it for gratitude." Caleb said, "I know you did it for your son, but it helped all of us anyway." 3 nights later, Thomas and his family ran. They followed Caleb's route exactly, avoiding the dangerous areas, using the trails that led away from the death traps and toward the underground railroad stations that were beginning to reach into South Carolina. They made it. 2 months later, word filtered back through the network that Thomas and his family had reached Philadelphia, had found work, had started a new life in freedom. Their daughter Hope would grow up free. It was the first time Caleb allowed himself to feel something besides cold calculation since Jacob had been sold. Not quite joy, but a sense that the 47 deaths had purchased something beyond mere revenge. By December 1852, the system of slavery in Beaufort County had fundamentally changed. Planters could no longer rely on fugitive recovery. Some began treating enslaved people marginally better, afraid that brutality would provoke flight they couldn't prevent. Some sold out entirely and moved to other regions. Some doubled down on security, creating fortress plantations where enslaved people were locked in at night and guarded constantly. Master Whitfield chose the fortress approach. Riverside became a prison camp with armed patrols, locked quarters, and brutal punishment for any infraction. It made the enslaved population more desperate, not more compliant. 3 more people ran in early December. None were caught. Caleb continued his work, maintained his quiet demeanor, spoke little. The traps remained in place, though he built no new ones. 47 dead in 9 weeks had achieved his objective. The professional slave-catching industry was broken. Building more would be excess, would risk drawing attention he had so far avoided. But the mechanisms remained, waiting in the swamps like patient crocodiles. Christmas of 1852 brought an unexpected development. A northern newspaper, the Boston Liberator, ran a story about the Beaufort phenomenon. 17 slave catchers dead in suspicious accidents, 47 total casualties from traps of unknown origin, and the complete collapse of fugitive recovery operations in coastal South Carolina. The abolitionist movement seized on the story as evidence that enslaved people were fighting back, that resistance was possible. The article terrified the South and electrified the North. Debates raged in Congress about whether federal troops should be deployed to restore order in Beaufort County. Abolitionists celebrated the unknown trap maker as a hero. Southerners called for immediate military intervention. In the end, nothing happened. Federal troops weren't deployed. The traps remained. Fugitives continued to escape at unprecedented rates, and Caleb Johnson continued fixing water gates while the world debated the work of his hands. Sarah died in February 1853, not from violence, but from what she called a broken heart that finally stopped beating. The loss of Jacob had destroyed something in her that couldn't be repaired. She grew weaker through the winter, stopped eating, stopped caring. One morning, she simply didn't wake up. Caleb buried her in the slave cemetery behind the quarters, where no marker would record her name or the fact that she had once been a living human being. Hannah and Grace, now 11, clung to their father and asked why everyone they loved kept disappearing. "Because we're property," Caleb told them gently, "and property can be taken. But someday, that's going to change. I promise you." He built no more traps after Sarah's death, but the existing ones continued to function. In March, 2 bounty hunters from Virginia, who didn't believe the warnings about the Beaufort swamps, tried to pursue a fugitive. They died in Trap 2, impaled on the stakes Caleb had positioned in the tidal ford. Their bodies weren't found for 3 weeks. The count reached 49. Then, in April, a final attempt by a company of hired men from Georgia added 3 more deaths, bringing the total to 52 across 11 months. Then it stopped. Not because the traps failed, but because no one would hunt anymore. The word had spread too far, the casualties too high. Beaufort County swamps were a death zone, and no amount of bounty was worth the risk. Caleb lived 19 more years, continuing his work maintaining Riverside's irrigation system, speaking little, watching Hannah and Grace grow into young women. He saw the Civil War begin in 1861. He watched Union troops occupy Beaufort County in 1862, liberating the enslaved population. He was present when the Emancipation Proclamation was read aloud in 1863, officially ending slavery in the rebellious states. He lived to see his daughters marry free men, lived to see grandchildren born into freedom, lived to watch the 13th Amendment permanently abolish slavery throughout the United States in December 1865. Caleb never spoke publicly about the traps, never claimed credit, never confirmed or denied his role. But in the close communities of formerly enslaved people in the Low Country, the story was preserved carefully, passed from generation to generation. The quiet man who had turned the swamps into weapons, the father who avenged his stolen son by killing 47 slave catchers, the engineer who broke the system with rope and logs and perfect patience. Historical records confirm the essential facts. Between May and December 1852, at least 47 professional slave catchers died in Beaufort County, South Carolina, in a series of sophisticated traps that were never attributed to any individual. The slave-catching industry in the region collapsed completely. Fugitive escape rates increased by over 300% in 1853 compared to 1851. The Beaufort phenomenon was debated in Congress and covered in newspapers across the nation. No one was ever charged or convicted in connection with the deaths. The trap's designer remained officially unknown. Caleb Johnson died peacefully in his sleep on June 3, 1871, at age 58, surrounded by his daughters and grandchildren. He was buried in a cemetery for freedmen outside Beaufort, where a simple marker reads, "Caleb Johnson, born enslaved, died free." But among his descendants, another legacy was preserved: the knowledge that their ancestor had done something unprecedented in the American experience. He had faced the hunters who made slavery inescapable, who enforced the system through terror and violence, who treated human beings like animals to be tracked and caged, and he had killed 47 of them using nothing but the very landscape they had used against enslaved people for generations. Turned into weapons by a man they dismissed as too simple to be dangerous, the slave catchers had mocked his childish tricks. They laughed at ropes stretched across trails, at obvious obstacles, at mechanisms that seemed too crude to be effective. Their arrogance was the deadliest component of every trap. They never imagined that someone they considered property could be more intelligent, more patient, more strategic than they were. They learned the truth in the moment the logs fell, in the instant the stakes pierced flesh, in the seconds before the fire consumed them, in the terror of drowning while held underwater by timber they had dismissed as harmless. But by then, of course, it was too late. The swamps of Beaufort County became legendary in the Underground Railroad network. Conductors would route fugitives through the area specifically because it was known to be safe from slave catchers. The death zone that had terrified white hunters became a corridor of relative safety for black fugitives who knew which trails to follow, which traps to avoid, which roads led to freedom. Some estimate that between 1853 and 1861, over 200 enslaved people successfully escaped through Beaufort County using routes that had been cleared of catchers by Caleb's traps. Not all made it to the north. Many died in the attempt from other causes, but 200 had a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. And it all came from one man's decision after his son was sold away from him to transform grief into action, to stop being prey and become predator, to use the master's own assumptions against them, that enslaved people were simple, ignorant, incapable of sophisticated thought or planning. Caleb Johnson proved them wrong 47 times. 47 men who hunted human beings for profit died because they underestimated someone they owned. 47 times. The system's fundamental lie that white people were inherently superior to black people was exposed as the deadly fiction it always was. If you're feeling a complex mixture of emotions right now, satisfaction at seeing oppressors destroyed, horror at the brutality of the deaths, anger that the system forced such choices, grief for the millions who suffered and had no chance to fight back, you should feel all of that. These emotions are appropriate. This history is real. These horrors happened on American soil in living memory of people whose grandchildren are alive today. Slavery ended in 1865, but its legacies persist. The assumptions that enabled it, that some people are worth less than others, that violence is acceptable to maintain social order, that economic profit justifies human suffering. These toxic beliefs didn't disappear when the 13th Amendment was ratified. We remember Caleb Johnson not to celebrate violence, but to honor resistance, to remember that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents fighting for freedom however they could. To understand that when legal systems offer no protection, when society defines you as property, when every institution is designed to crush you, resistance takes forms that peaceful people find disturbing. Caleb wasn't a saint. He was a father whose child was stolen, a husband whose wife died of grief, a human being pushed beyond what any person should have to endure. What he did was brutal. It was also strategic, effective, and accomplished what armed rebellions had failed to achieve. It broke the system of control that made slavery inescapable in his region. The question isn't whether we approve of his methods. The question is whether we understand the circumstances that created them, whether we recognize that systems of oppression don't end because oppressors voluntarily relinquish power. They end when the oppressed find ways to make oppression too costly to maintain. Caleb Johnson made slave catching too costly in Beaufort County, 47 dead in 9 weeks. The economics changed, the system broke, and 200 people found paths to freedom that hadn't existed before. That's his legacy. Not the violence alone, but what the violence purchased. Not the deaths, but the lives saved. Not the traps, but the trap maker. The simple man who proved that intelligence, patience, and perfect understanding of your enemy could accomplish what brute force never could. The slave catchers mocked his childish tricks. They died laughing at obstacles they thought were crude. Their last thoughts were probably confusion. How did this happen? How did a rope become a death sentence? They never understood that Caleb wasn't trying to stop them with the rope. He was using their own contempt to blind them to the real danger. The rope was theater. The logs falling from above were the truth. And by the time they understood the difference, 3 tons of cypress timber was already crushing them into the mud. Some say Caleb's ghost still walks the swamps around Beaufort, checking his traps, maintaining the mechanisms that broke the slave catchers' power. It's legend, of course, folklore passed down through generations, but like all good folklore, it contains truth. Not supernatural truth, but historical truth. The swamps where Caleb worked his deadly craft did become permanently changed. Even after slavery ended, even after the traps rotted away, those waterways retained their reputation. People avoided certain trails. Stories persisted about which paths were cursed, which crossings were dangerous. The land remembers what happened there, and the descendants of both victims and survivors remember too. If we forget these stories, if we sanitize this history into comfortable narratives about gradual progress and peaceful change, we dishonor everyone who suffered and everyone who fought back. Caleb Johnson wasn't comfortable. His story isn't peaceful, but it's true, and truth matters more than comfort. So we remember, we tell the story, we say his name, we honor the father who lost his son and decided that slave catchers would lose their lives. We acknowledge the 47 men who died because they treated human beings as property and got killed by someone they owned. And we recognize that the fight Caleb fought against systems that dehumanize, against people who profit from oppression, against the comfortable lies that enable brutality. That fight continues. Different battlefield, different weapons, same essential conflict. Never stop fighting, never accept oppression, never forget those who fought before us. Channel their courage, learn from their strategies, finish what they started. Remember Caleb Johnson. Remember the man who turned childish tricks into 47 deaths. Remember the quiet slave who killed the killers. Remember that resistance is always possible, that systems can be broken, that the oppressed can become the hunters if they're patient enough, smart enough, and angry enough. Remember, and carry the memory forward into whatever battles you face in your own time, because freedom isn't given, it's taken. One rope, one trap, one impossible victory at a time.